Good evening, and welcome to episode 8 of SlantCast, the official podcast of Slant Books. My name is Gregory Wolfe, and I am Slant's publisher and editor. We're grateful that you've chosen to share this time with us. Tonight, we're finally doing something I've been threatening to do for several months now, but haven't had time to pull off thanks to the steady stream of online book launches for newly released Slant titles. In short, we're finally going to do our first episode devoted purely to a literary topic of our own choosing. We're excited to do that because, as we've conceived it, Slant's mission is more expansive than simply the publication of our own titles. We're fighting to defend the integrity of literature itself from the powerful ideologies and interests that want to reduce it to propaganda, didacticism, or just treat it as a relic of the past. We're equally concerned about the pervasive influence of contemporary technologies and habits that have made it harder to master the art of close reading, deep comprehension, and careful discernment that enduring literature seeks to cultivate in us. So, we're going to continue to try to find time to undertake episodes of SlantCast that touch on literature past and present, as well as other topics related to the embattled but living tradition of literary humanism. Tonight, we'll be delving into two recently published novels by Cormac McCarthy, The Passenger and Stella Maris, books that many of us have been puzzling over and occasionally marveling over in recent months. These are the first books that McCarthy has published in 16 years following his novel, The Road, and they have appeared as the author is soon to turn 90 years old. Before I introduce Jonathan Geltner, our guest on tonight's episode, I'd just like to remind you that if you have questions or thoughts about the books, you can type them in the chat. Time permitting, I will try to share as many of those as possible, or even have you pose your question or comment directly. Because I read out the long version of Jonathan's biography last summer when we launched his debut novel, Absolute Music, I'll just go with the short version tonight. Jonathan Geltner was born in eastern Massachusetts, but grew up mainly in Cincinnati, Ohio. He studied English classics and French at the University of Cincinnati, pursued graduate work in English at the University of Chicago, and earned an MFA in fiction from Warren Wilson College. He published a translation of Paul Claudel's 5 Great Odes with Angelico Press in 2020, and the novel Absolute Music in 2022. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Greg. Greetings, all.
Well, let's start off with the question I want to pose to you, Jonathan. After all this time, he comes out with these novels. Were they anything like what you would have expected them to be, or did they throw you for a loop?
I don't think I found them surprising in the context of sort of fiction generally in recent years. It's almost as if, McCarthy's been doing his thing for a while, and yet he just kind of naturally blended into some other trends, or not to use that word trivially, but forces at work maybe, that I sort of sense are abroad in the world of fiction these days. So in that sense, no. But and it's been a while. I mean, I haven't read his other books in a number of years, but in terms of what he's done previously, if this weren't, something he'd written in his 80s, I would say, oh yeah, maybe this is a departure in a new direction. But instead, I mean, obviously he's at the end of his long and amazing career, and so these books come as a kind of capstone, which adds a whole nother dimension to how we perceive them. These aren't books that he published in the middle of his career, with presumably decades more in which to write. And So, I mean, you kind of have to take it, I think, in terms of where is he in his own life, and then relative to the other things he's published, and finally in the broadest context of fiction as a whole. And in some, so, in each of those ways, are they surprising? Are they somehow not what we would expect from him? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of what I've picked up on in other books in these. He delights in various styles. He has an ability to channel this kind of distinctively American style that comes down through Melville and Faulkner, and he deploys that in these books, though judiciously, with great restraint compared to what he's capable of. Something like Blood Meridian, that's written entirely in that style. I mean, to me, I guess it didn't. So it's surprising, or it's a bit of a disjunct if you look at maybe some of his other books. It's not surprising if you look at the whole context of fiction, and it wasn't surprising to me as like a capstone work. It felt like a summation of a lot of big ideas. And if that sounds too intellectual or schematic, then it had a kind of elegiac farewell feeling to it, these books.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I mean, what I find curious about it is the very fact that he's sort of working in mixed registers. I mean, it's almost like he's thrown the kitchen sink in this book. There is the high diction of the Faulknerian, Melvillian. I mean, there are passages that are like music like you would expect from, books like Blood Meridian or All the Pretty Horses. But then there's this demotic, kind of slang and kind of all these registers, humor thrown in. That was quite, kind of kick for me to see, again, sort of high, low, and medium varieties of humor from these sort of kind of bizarre characters like John Shedden, this kind of hedonistic kind of crazy guy, to kind of shady character, to the wonderful W.C. Fields, the transgender character who's just so, fascinating on so many different levels. So yeah, and not to mention that in some ways it feels like he's revisiting his own oeuvre.
Yeah.
He goes back to Knoxville. He kind of touches, you can almost hear, it's like an overture, but at the end of the work, not the beginning of the work, like kind of gathering up all the threads of his literary styles and interests.
Yeah, there's all these characters who have like kind of gone off to just sort of die alone. I mean, that's putting it a little too darkly, but and I don't know, how much we want to sort of give away plot points and stuff, but yeah, I mean, he's got so I'll work up to the Western guy, but so there's Sheeden, whom you just mentioned, and I'd like to just read just a bit from something he says in a minute here. But so Sheeden eventually dies, and he's from Knoxville, as is the Western siblings, who are the main characters in these books, Bobby and Alicia, originally Alice Western, and so it's a kind of it's revisiting his own real roots and Suttree and all this, and Knoxville has a kind of inexplicable presence in these books. It's not the main setting, but it's like it intrudes at various points, and Sheeden goes off there and dies. And obviously the sister Alicia dies. I mean, you know that right from the beginning. It's in the past. In an asylum. So, and you've got Western not dying, but going off to different places in forms of exile. New Orleans, which is the primary setting of the passenger, is not his home. He's from Knoxville, so he's kind of already in exile. And he goes to Idaho at one point, and it's really a beautiful passage in that book. And then eventually ends up in Spain, just kind of the middle of nowhere on the coast of Valencia. And so you have these people crawling off into, and there's the crazy guy. I'm forgetting his name now, but he's living in a trailer out in the bayou. And Bobby Western goes to visit him at one point, trying to get him to show his face in the civilized world again, for the sake of his family and friends who are concerned about him. And he's just holed up in this trailer, and he's crazy alcoholic, and he won't come out really much, but except he does eventually, actually. But there's all these weird recluses, and some of them are dying, and some of them are reclusive or secluded against their will. That's certainly the case with Bobby Western. He's on the run from strange forces, including at least the U.S. government, and they're departing from the world. They're done. They can't fit in anymore. Their time is over, and they're sort of saying farewell to at least normal life, mainstream society, and if not life altogether. And that kind of gives the books a profound feeling of sort of retreat from the world, marginality. I don't know, there's various ways of putting it, but it does kind of somehow all add up to a feeling of farewell for me reading these books. I mean, maybe if to get at them in one way, you can just ask, what is like the overall feeling, the overall tone? And there are wonderful moments of humor, and there's wonderful moments of description where it's clear that McCarthy himself or the characters are appreciating and enjoying being able to be conscious of whatever environment it is. It's often New Orleans, or it's various more sort of rural settings. But the overall feeling suggested by the structure of the book, which seems to be this constellation of characters who have all in one way or another been just sort of ejected, it's a feeling of retreat or
exile, maybe
removal, exile. Yeah, various
strangers in a strange land.
Yeah, they are. Though some of them do it very confidently, like you mentioned. The what is her name? Deborah, right? The transgender.
Debussy. The wonderfully named Debussy Fields.
Debussy,
as in the composer Claude Debussy. Debussy
right.
Fields.
Yeah,
there's puns galore in the book.
And maybe Debussy Fields. Yeah, and that's her assumed name anyway. Yes, George, I'll do that in a second. So that character has certainly moments of startling confidence, but also is quite broken and wounded, vulnerable. And as you would expect, remember this book is set in 1980. No, The Passenger is set in 1980,
right,
in New Orleans. I guess it goes into 1981. Anyway,
the passage I want to read actually is actually Debussy Fields.
Okay, yeah, let's just to get something, because these are actually minor characters, but maybe it's good to read some stuff from minor characters. I'd like to read John Sheedon, who's another guy who's he's hilarious, but also just tragically broken and sad in a lot of ways. So let's do that, and then this will give me time to stall and get back a little bit. He's
a bit like a Falstaffian character, but with the kind of intellectual veneer. Like he's obviously well read and well educated, but he's just purely, this seemingly hedonistic character who's sort of we'll learn more about him when you read. So why don't you go ahead?
I mean, he's he's almost implausible. I would say. Apparently, he and Bobby Western, the main, one of the two main characters, the sibling pair, go back to their teenage years. They're both from Knoxville. So he's a kind of foil, or not a doppelganger, but an alter ego, or a Bobby Western who could have been, I guess, if Western had ever been a hedonist. Sheedon even sounds like a hedonist. Anyway, so he's this extremely grandiloquent, or articulate anyway, guy who's just a con artist and a petty criminal and a lascivious man, and just basically every nasty, petty sort of thing you could be. Not, a terrible man, but a paltry figure, and yet he cuts a grand figure in the book in a way because of how he speaks. So at one point, Bobby Western's walking around and runs into him, and they just start talking, as happens many times. This is one of the great things about studying a novel in 1980 is characters can just like wander around and run into each other, and that's how they encounter each other, instead of like having to text like, hey, are you going to be at this restaurant? I'll meet you there. Anyway, I kind of like that. They just sort of wander around New Orleans and run into each other at these random restaurants and bars. So he runs into Sheedon and sits there and has a conversation with him. And at one point, Sheedon says the following. And so again, remember, this is set in 1980. And so it's post the 60s and like the beginning of the sexual revolution, but not by much. I mean, it's as close to the summer of love as we are to like Obama's first term or something. And so that's in the historical context in which Sheedon is saying this. And he reflects on himself a lot, which in most characters would be infuriating, but he's articulate and weirdly prophetic, so you tolerate it. He says, I've encountered no greater mystery in life than myself. In a just society, I'd be warehoused somewhere. Which is, of course, what happened to Bobby Western's sister. But of course, what really threatens the scofflaw is not the just society, but the decaying one. It is here that he finds himself becoming slowly indistinguishable from the citizenry. He finds himself co-opted. Difficult these days to be a rake or a bounder, a roué, a deviant, a pervert. Surely you're joking. The new dispensations have all but erased these categories from the language. You can no longer be a loose woman, for instance, a trollop. The whole concept is meaningless. You can't even be a drug addict. At best, you're just a user. A user? What the fuck is that? We've gone from dope fiends to drug users in just a few short years. It doesn't take Nostradamus to see where this is headed. The most heinous of criminals clamoring for standing. Serial killers and cannibals claiming a right to their lifestyle. Like anyone else, I try to sort out where I fit into this menagerie. Without malefactors, the world of the righteous is robbed of all meaning. As for myself, again, if I can't be decorum's sworn enemy while savoring its fruits, I simply see no place for me at all. What would you recommend, Squire? That's what he calls Bobby Western. Go home and draw a warm bath and climb in and open a vein? Never mind. I see you weighing the merits of it. I enjoy my life, Squire, against all odds. Anyway, Hoffer has it right. Real trouble doesn't begin in a society until boredom has become its most general feature. Boredom will drive even quiet-minded people down paths they'd never imagined. So that's just one paragraph, fairly typical of John Sheedon. And yeah, it just seems coming from 1980. If I really had any skill, I would have read that in some kind of, I don't know, Knoxvillian accent crossed with New Orleans, maybe, but I can't do either one of those. I'm a Yankee, so.
Yes, he's an utterly venal character criticizing the dictatorship of relativism.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, I think these minor characters, I mean, to me, what I feel like the echo in his oeuvre that really resonates for me is The Crossing. It's not one of his most read books. In fact, I think a lot of people find it almost too much. It's the second book of the Border trilogy, and it's sort of where he shifts into what I call visionary mode, where you get this parade of characters, shamans and recluses and hermits, and they tell these stories. You know, they're kind of one after another of these visionary, sometimes post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic in any sense, were tales that seem to get at kind of issues of theodicy, you know, justifying the ways of God to man. And I feel like some of these characters, they're maybe more mundane, they're not quite as mysterious, and yet they have an inner kind of mystery themselves. And W.C. Fields strikes that note for me. Yep. So let me read my little bit. They're having a meal at Galatoire's, which I think is fabulous. And W.C. Fields is trying to share a little bit about the difficulties she's gone through in coming to understand her identity and her desire to be a woman. And she says, of course, by then I'd started drinking, and that almost finished me off. I was a born alcoholic. Luckily, I met someone, sheer blind luck. He got me into AA. I had trouble with the God thing. A lot of people do. And then I woke up one night in the middle of the night, and I was lying there, and I thought, if there was no higher power, then I'm it. And that just scared the shit out of me. There is no God, and I am she. So I began to really work on that. I'm still working on it. Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Excuse me. But I've made some progress. I was mad at him for screwing me up the way he did, but maybe he's not as perfect as people like to think. He's got a lot on his plate, and he has to do it all himself, no help. Do you believe in God? That's Bobby Western asking. The truth? Sure. I don't know who God is or what he is, but I don't believe all this stuff got here by itself, including me. Maybe everything evolves just like they say it does. But if you sound it to its source, you have to come ultimately to an intention. Sound it to its source? You like that? Pascal. About a year after this, I woke up again, and it was like I heard this voice in my sleep, and I could still hear the echo of it. And it said, if something did not love you, you would not be here. And I said, okay. And so, you know, for me, this character of W.C. Fields, it's sort of like almost like a Tiresias figure. You remember the character from Greek mythology who was notably, you know, hermaphroditic, male and female. Almost like Anthony Blanche in Brideshead Revisited, same kind of character, where someone who has this experience of both dimensions of gender gains access to a kind of almost a prophetic vision. And
this is very much a shamanic characteristic, right? Which he taps into in a few other places, maybe, but yeah, it's at least momentarily and in glimpses being able to speak with some authority of the entire human race, because encompassing, you know, both sexes. Yeah.
Well, why don't we tackle the main characters? I mean, Bobby and Alicia have this.
Because you got both sexes there too. Yep.
They are of Jewish heritage. Their father was a scientist for the nuclear program, the Manhattan Project, and the Oak Ridge refinery. So that brings in all the math and the science and the physics. What do you make of all that?
Yeah. So, like you say, these novels have like the whole kitchen sink thrown in. Bobby Western works as a salvage diver when we first meet him in these books. And you get some remarkably knowledgeable, or so I assume, descriptions of the process of salvage diving. But he's an intellectual, so presumably the reason John Sheedon calls him Squire is to kind of poke fun. And Sheedon knows his whole past, knows about his dead sister, knows the most significant thing about this pair of siblings, namely that they were passionately in love with each other, to the exclusion of being able to form romantic or erotic connections with anyone else.
Which is obviously a pretty freaky thing to throw into a novel, and a lot of people, rightly kind of seize up almost. So it's almost curious why McCarthy was willing to take such a risk of putting off the reader.
Yeah, it's a really good question. What did he gain by making them like this? I mean, there's no reason why Bobby Western couldn't have loved his sister very deeply, as siblings do, and been tragically, disturbed by her death, but it's suicide, when she's very young, 20, I think, and without having to have the incestuous element in there. So why put that in? I frankly don't have a good answer. I can't figure it out. I was going to say that significantly they don't break the taboo. I mean, they both know about each other, that they're in love with each other and that they don't want anyone else, but they don't. You learn in Stella Maris, which is entirely comprised of conversations between Alicia and her counselor, I think he's called, and basically a psychiatrist. There's no narrator in the book. You learn in that book, at least her line is that they never had sex, and they never. But she wanted to marry him. She wanted to have children with him. And I for a long time, actually, just until tonight, when I was going back through the books a little bit, I thought, well, he did make sure that they didn't actually do that. That they that was their passion, but they didn't act on it. And then I read the part in The Passenger where Bobby Western has lost everything. He's been locked out of all of his assets. His life has been shut down in a really mysterious way that never gets resolved, and gets sort of just lost sight of, to the point where you realize eventually, like, it wasn't even it's like a mystery thriller in places, but actually that's not the point of the book at all. It's a total red herring. But anyway, Bobby's got nothing, and he goes off to Idaho in the winter from New Orleans, a bit of a climate geographical change, and spends this winter there. And he's like starving and shivering, and his mental stability is somewhat questionable. His sister's like certifiable, as we used to say, and actually in an institution and undergoing therapy and stuff. But Bobby's not necessarily all that lucid himself. He at one point actually sees and talks with what was supposed to be a creature of his sister's imagination, and he's got all kinds of issues. And one of the things that happens up in Idaho in this winter is he has these bad dreams. And the only dream that the narrator gives us that he has, it's not definite, but you could construe it as a nightmare recollection of an abortion, which perhaps his sister had. So I just discovered that, like I say, going back through the books, and realized, I don't know. I mean, because obviously Alicia is an unreliable narrator. Any first person voice in any book is always potentially unreliable. So,
but they're both depicted as geniuses. I mean, as intellectually brilliant. So while they have mental health issues, obviously, you might say Bobby does too. His maybe are just more sublimated than hers. So there's this narrative insistence on their being brilliant. Like truly top of the line, like, and of course it seems to derive from their father, the great nuclear scientist of the Manhattan Project. So I'm just curious, I know you care a lot about science, and of course McCarthy famously has been hanging out at the Santa Fe Institute, which is sort of a great think tank for, all these great minds. They're probably best known, I guess, for the physicists, but also the mathematicians, and math becomes itself a subject of both books, especially Stella Maris. And so I think something about this lineage from the Manhattan Project, the nuclear atomic bomb, through their kind of math physics genius to their mental issues, there's kind of something going on with that kind of cluster of themes. I just wonder if you thought at all about that.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to explain it is that there is nothing like mathematics to push the question of metaphysics. You just can't get too deep into it before you have to confront whether you think abstraction of any kind can be real. So the fundamental philosophical debate between what in the later Middle Ages was realism versus nominalism, and what later on would get slightly restylized as realism versus idealism. That just is intrinsic to math, higher mathematics, well, actually any number theory, anything, even arithmetic. So one of the there's basically two ways. I mean, there's actually a number of ways you can get very nuanced about this. Philosophy of mathematics is pretty fascinating stuff, but you fundamentally are going to end up either being a realist or something else. In other words, you're going to believe that mathematical objects enjoy some degree of being, or you think they aren't. They don't. They're completely speculative. They're unreal. They're a product of a particular kind of language or discourse or whatever you want to call it, and they just exist inside of people's heads. And when there are no more people in whose heads math can exist, then there will be no more math. And people have said, because if you talk about music without language, or to quote the title of my novel, Absolute Music, if you talk about music of that kind, you're talking about something that can be reduced perfectly to mathematics. So music and math coincide there. And they're wonderful arenas in which to really put yourself to this question of, do I believe that such things describe reality? Do they actually have real reference? Are there reference to all these, partial differential equations? Or does a musical score, which has no verbal apparatus of any kind, nonetheless mean something outside of itself? Does it point outside of itself? Does it have some kind of transcendent intentionality? And one of the most interesting things about Alicia, who's the particularly genius of the two siblings, the mathematical genius, she's like at University of Chicago doing a PhD or something like that in math when she's like 17, is that she is vehemently against what gets called, lumped together under the idea like Platonist or Platonic math, realism, some kind of notion that math is real, that it has this, it does actually describe deep reality. And she seems to be very, at least on my reading, quite hostile to that. I mean, the fact, most great mathematicians have more or less assented to some kind of realism. You can't really do math unless you believe that you're doing something real.
I've actually speculated that, part of McCarthy's hanging out at the Santa Fe Institute in a way is almost like a indirect indictment of the humanities world, the literary world, where everything is constructed, reality is constructed, is where anti-metaphysicalism kind of reigns in a way, and that by hanging out with the scientists, he's kind of putting in a vote for that connection to reality.
Yeah, except that science, sort of the public face of scientific discourse in recent generations has been totally materialistic, naturalistic, in a way that's very different from, but bizarrely complementary to how the humanities have been, or the arts have been. It's just sort of one side goes all in on matter, on the physical nature, and the other goes all in on the socially constructed or whatever. But both are basically saying, like, there's nothing. Ideas aren't real. They're just they're tools. They're systems of oppression, or they're just fanciful elaborations or evolutionary tools or whatever. But there's a million ways to sort of undercut it, but undercut Platonism or transcendentalism or whatever you want to call it, realism. And I like that. I buy that. I mean, and I can't blame him for it either. Like, I'd hang out at the Santa Fe Institute if I could get a point across by doing it. The question is, does he come by any metaphysical conviction there, which he's trying to get across in these books? And I don't, or anywhere else. And that I'm not so sure about. But actually, to bring this back around to the question for me to elaborate on connection to contemporary fiction, he's definitely not going all in on the social constructivism angle. Even though Alicia is skeptical of any transcendent Platonist realist interpretation of mathematics, she's actually just skeptical and confused about everything. She doesn't know, and she certainly doesn't allow that that everything's reducible to some simplistic interpretation of things, a la naturalism, materialism, and she's just sort of tortured, and she's very deeply moved by music. I like to read another passage later on in her voice about music, but because she has this incredibly expensive violin, and she plays a little bit, and she just sort of loves the instrument itself. She's into topology, which is the study of shapes, particularly how shapes change without being ruptured. And topology is capable of describing objects which cannot exist in our physical universe. But so it's a excellent venue in which to think about, like, can math describe things that are more real than real? Can it get at something that's in some sense out there, but that actually could never even be realized in our own regular world? And she applies that to the instrument itself, to the violin. She's very confused and troubled, but she's capable of being profoundly moved by music and having a sort of awe, but a very terrified awe, sublime awe of mathematics, even if she refuses to commit to a Platonist interpretation of it, which I find really interesting. And these books, so these books are this welter and uneasy, almost combat of ideas. They're very much novels of ideas. But
my question is this: I mean, to the extent that we have some sympathy for the protagonist, maybe not as much as in many novels. Maybe our distance from them is, partly our horror at the incest theme, and the fact that Bobby is a very passive character in general, just sort of seemingly letting things just happen around him. Alicia, sometimes seems kind of very dark and terrifying. But this heritage of the nuclear bomb, of science as potentially being for the real or against the real, I think these are related. Like, I think there's a critique of the characters as well as a desire on the author's part for us to be sympathetic. Like, they're not necessarily getting everything right. There's an irony in the sense that maybe they're missing something that they shouldn't be missing, that they should be able to see something, but they just can't.
Well, yeah, there's a character, I'm forgetting who it is now. Might even be the drunk guy holed up in the bayou, who straight up tells Bobby at one point, everyone's born able to see the miraculous. You have to choose not to. I think that's almost exactly verbatim what he says. And he's the same character who says he's had a vision of Jesus. I think the same character. These guys, Bobby and Alicia, are bombarded from all sides, existentially, intellectually, by signals that could not be stronger. There's more out there than you're letting yourself engage with. And it is something of a mystery to me why, and maybe this is what you mean by critique implicit in the books, why they seem unreceptive to stuff. Why is Alicia anti-Platonist? Why is Bobby like constantly encountering all these crazy people who have had amazing experiences of the transcendent or just the gift of being, and people like Debussy, people like these weirdos and misfits that he hangs out with in New Orleans, and they're just totally just unreceptive to that, at least most of the time. But I will say that at the end, Bobby is changing. If I usually can't stand people who are like deep characters have to change and develop and grow and all this. It sounds like trite advice to beginning writers, but Bobby does seem to exhibit some significant change at the end, which I did find moving. And he's at this point he's in Spain. Why Spain? No reason. There's no reason. He picks a place that he used to know when back in the days when he was driving race cars around Europe, and it's across from Ibiza, and he's living in a windmill. I mean, it doesn't get much more quixotic than that. And in Spain, living in a windmill in Spain. I mean, this is fairly heavy-handed signal here, and at that point, it's unclear how much time goes by. It could be quite a number of years, actually.
Yeah.
After the main events of The Passenger, which is 1980, 81. And he runs into, and he's just like, he does nothing. He's got a little bit of money. He lives in a windmill. He hangs out in cafes. He watches the ocean. Occasionally he goes out to the island and has dinner at some rich friend's house. And he's just and he hangs out in churches, lights candles in churches.
Yeah.
And he runs into this guy, some American he knows, who like doesn't appear before that, I don't think, or not significantly. It's not important who he is really. But the guy's like, "What the heck are you doing out here?" And he just says, like, I'm learning to pray. Actually, I mean, it's really brief. I can probably find it at the end of the book here, maybe. But he's undergone some kind of change, and he hasn't really been able to like live a normal life. You kind of get the sense like that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
His friend's asking. He says, "What about you?" He says, "I live in a windmill. I light candles for the dead, and I'm trying to learn how to pray." "What do you pray for?" "I don't pray for anything. I just pray." "I thought you were an atheist." "No. I don't have any religion," which has got to be one of the best little lines in the whole book.
That's a great line. Yeah.
I mean, the implication, of course, that atheism is a religion and that's not his religion.
Yeah.
He doesn't actually have one, but he prays. And the kind of prayer he's describing there is a silent prayer, a centering prayer, a stillness, a quiet, contemplative prayer.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, for me, I think the fact that he's changing is important, but these books, and of course Stella Maris ends, of course, with the character we know as chosen you might say, the nihilistic answer, the suicide. Now, of course, she's young and troubled, so we can soften our judgment of that. But I think one of the typical charges leveled against McCarthy, and you can almost see it from, pretty straightforward reading of the books, is that he's a nihilist, that he has a very dark view of the world. And I guess the way I've tried to understand this is that I think people sometimes embrace the protagonist a little too directly and don't see this ironic distance that, the fact of what they're missing. And I spoke about this recently at a conference about the tragic vision of McCarthy, where I point out, for example, in the Border trilogy, you get these two great characters, John Grady Cole and Billy Parham, who are like, yes, they're cowboys, and yes, they're somewhat archaic figures in the mid-1940s, which is when the books take place, but they are really kind of heroic figures. They're actually representative of the best of American self-reliance and love of nature, and they're very self-disciplined characters. They know how to relate to animals, but they have inner discipline. They're noble, they're generous, and yet they continually come a cropper. They experience tragic events that they don't fully understand. And while I don't want to kind of hog all the time here elaborating it, part of my argument there is that's kind of truly a tragic sensibility. After all, if you are a good character but have a flaw, something that you miss, something you don't understand. I mean, these guys they miss the kind of culture reflected in the Mexican culture that they travel into, a culture that's not obsessed by property and fixing stuff in terms of justice being always about trying to go back to square one. Mexican culture is more of a tragic culture, accepting the reality of the impossibility of human beings fixing things that are broken. If you apply this to these characters of Bobby and Alicia and in these stories, you could argue that they're brilliant and troubled, yes, but that they also they come close. The characters are telling them, these side characters that we've been quoting, they're kind of getting messages of truth and wholeness. They just don't get it. And to me, I think that's why I think it's wrong to just assume that McCarthy is embracing nihilism or darkness. He always leaves this gap open for us to kind of interpret.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Even just in terms of the art of fiction and how a responsible reader should approach it. You can't let the predominant tone or feeling count for too much. You have to remember there's a distance there that matters. But I want to go back to what you were trying to bring up earlier about the atom bomb and the fact that the Western sibling's father was on the Manhattan Project. I mean, so unlike with the Border trilogy, which is happening at the pivotal, if I remember correctly, in the pivotal sort of decade in the 1940s, basically, right? Maybe the 50s, maybe, but like it feels like an archaic older world, right? And this is 1980 and after, except, well, Alicia's book, I guess, is 1972. But still, it's late. It's decidedly post-war. It's post-Hiroshima. It's post-Auschwitz. And those are the two things, both related to Jews because of the ethnicity of some of the people, including their father who worked on the Manhattan Project, Einstein and all these other people. So Judaism is bound up with this in a really interesting way. But I mean, most famously, it's lain like an oracle over Western literature for decades now. Adorno's pronouncement that after Auschwitz, it is barbaric to write poetry. And you can swap in for poetry really any imaginative literature that aspires to present any sort of enchanted or metaphysical world. It's just inconceivable after the 1940s because of what we did. Both what the Nazis did, but then also what what the West did, or the Allies did, in developing and immediately deploying, as soon as it was even remotely feasible, an atomic weapon. These guys are living that out. So I asked myself a lot while reading this book, why the heck is this thing set in 1980? Who gives a shit about 1980? Why am I reading about 1980 New Orleans? It doesn't make any sense. And that specific year, I don't think matters. But what he needed to be doing was working with the children of the generation that committed the Shoah, that endured the Shoah, that dropped the atom bomb, that had the atom bomb dropped on them. He needed to be working with the children of that generation, because he's looking at what happens when you live that out, that legacy. What happens when that is your immediate legacy? And so if there's a reason why these guys are excused, Bobby and Alicia, from being as receptive as they might be to some of the signals from a transcendent world that they seem to be getting, or that their own genius gives them access to, especially in Alicia's case, it does seem to be that they are very consciously haunted by that, especially Bobby. I mean, it actually says that. The narrator tells us at one point, let me find it here, that he's conscious of that. The passage is, Western, that would be Bobby, fully understood that he owed his existence to Adolf Hitler, that the forces of history which had ushered his troubled life into the tapestry were those of Auschwitz and Hiroshima, the sister events that sealed forever the fate of the West. Sister events. Since when are events feminine? That word is obviously a deliberate usage in this particular context. The word sister means a lot to Bobby Western, but yeah. So I mean, that's right there on the page.
Yeah.
And I actually kind of was incredibly moved when I read that and realized how overtly he was working with that in these books, because we are actually getting away from that. I mean, McCarthy's an old dude. And thank God for it, because that's why he's able to do this. We're getting past the point where this is within living memory, and we're starting to lose sight of just how epochic that time was.
Yeah.
The novels come as a sort of if they're sort of tugging you on the sleeve urgently and saying, we're not over that yet, by the way. I don't know, you might have been lulled into some sense of security in the last 20 or 30 years because more and more people can't remember that. And, we've, for the most part, despite obviously continual strife in various parts of the world, been extremely comfortable. But these novels are a sharp reminder of that prophetic thing that Adorno said. And I think that that's welcome, because there hasn't, in a way, been any great sort of metaphysical progress since then, or philosophical progress since then. But but I do think that there is a renewed desire and willingness to bring the transcendent into fiction. That's why I kind of talked about that earlier in the larger context for these books, and sort of trying to reimagine that.
Yeah. I mean, is there a way to draw some kind of line between the dangers of abstraction from the world, of a kind of solipsism or denial of realism in any reasonable definition, and the kind of turning inwards? I mean, an atom bomb is like turning inwards, right? It's literally created by these other explosions that force things together, these atoms together, and that releases the energy. And of course, incest is a coming together of two similar things that are kind of, otherwise should be touching the world outside, not each other. And so I wonder if there's kind of there's a kind of dark theme here that manifests in the kind of struggles that these two characters have, because that's the world that they've inherited, and they're struggling to figure out how to escape it, and they can't, and that's the tragedy.
Yeah, it's right. It's like, it's not that they're not given the metaphysical inputs. It's just that they can't accept it. They don't. Their legacy won't let them accept it. And I hadn't thought about the analogy between incest and nuclear fission would have been the first one, so splitting them apart. But then they developed bombs that would fuse the atoms. And those are even far worse, actually. That's what our nuclear arsenal is now.
I mean, the writer that I actually started to feel some kinship with this particular set of books, and maybe it's just because I was reading something, but I felt there was a kind of a Kafka dimension.
Yeah,
I was actually just reading a beautiful piece in the New Criterion, came out a few years ago, How to Read Kafka by John M. Ellis. And so, for example, in that piece, he says, for the Enlightenment thinkers, the people that Kafka, presumably lived in a culture that accepted, for the Enlightenment thinkers, the consistent application of reason would solve all the problems created by human foolishness. But that's not the way things work out in The Burrow, which is the story is being critiqued. There, reason keeps coming up against the problems to which there are no answers, and it's precisely because the animal can't stop trying to reason out the perfect solution to the burrow's design that he is driven mad. In Kafka's story, reason doesn't overcome our mental weaknesses because it's driven by and intertwined with them. And that just really felt to me like really resonant, even with the whole notion of the thriller element of the novel that peters out, as you say, that it's kind of very postmodern in the sense that there's a mystery that nobody ultimately solves or even seems interested in solving.
Yeah, they forget about it. I mean, yeah, well, that's actually where the Kafkaesque element came in for me, though, because there's two things that made it reminded me of Kafka or Philip K. Dick, maybe. And one is that mystery thriller element that is super weird, makes no sense. It's so unlikely the way that Bobby Western seems to be pursued by the government, for sure. IRS,
Men in Black.
Yeah, well, literally. I mean, at one point. But also, there's a strong suggestion by the mob somehow, because he's got this mafia friend that he goes to his restaurant, and we get treated to this huge theory about, or not mafia friend, but he's like, he runs a restaurant that the mafia frequents or something, whatever. And we get treated to this huge theory about the JFK assassination out of nowhere, thanks to this character. And so he's like pursued by these nefarious governmental or like para state forces that just vanish at some point. But they're so implausible. I mean, if the government wants to screw with you, they're just going to do whatever they want to do. There's not this weird cat and mouse game where, like, the IRS, he goes into an IRS office and talks to the guy, and the guy's like, yeah, you're in trouble. It's like, well, if the IRS wants to arrest you, they're going to arrest you. And at one point, the mafia character is like, what you don't understand is that you are under arrest. They just haven't taken you to jail yet, or something like that. It's like, no, that's not how it works. You're just going to be arrested. Like, there's this whole legal system that you're going to get dragged through, or they'll just find you and drag it out.
Yeah, they're sort of like a soft absurdist.
Yeah,
it's so absurdist, but not in a kind of dire Camusian, Sartrean, but a kind of almost comic, soft comic absurdism.
Because it's like in the background, it's like driving the plot, which is basically the point of the plot is basically to push Bobby Western into weirder and weirder locales. Like, first he has to go. oh shoot, now I'm getting it mixed up. But he ends up living on a beach in like Mississippi, or Alabama or something, and then he's in Idaho, and then eventually he's in Spain and in a windmill, and it's like, all right, at that point the guy's done. Like no one's going to care about him anymore now. But it just gets pushed further and further into weirdness, and it's so implausible that you're like, this feels like a Kafka novel where there's just this force that is never going to let up, and it's just going to make his life hell, and you're never going to understand it. It's just it's his fate. Because he had this terrible father, well, not terrible father, but a father involved in a terrible thing, and you know, and an incestuous passion, and so it's, you know, this is his fate. It's almost like a Greek tragedy in that way. You brought up tragedy earlier, and certainly incest plays a huge role in that genre. So, yeah, that was Kafkaesque to me. But the other thing, of course, we haven't talked about at all, that could make it surreal in some way is the visions that Alicia has, mainly Alicia, that are so strange. They're also so. I mean, the thing that Kafka does so well is turn the bureaucratic world of you know, bourgeois Europe at its heyday into it exposes it as the hellish system that it was. And Alicia's vision, so Alicia has this recurring vision of a weird figure she refers to only as the kid, with some obvious references to previous McCarthy and that. And he comes with a whole entourage, and is a bizarrely, I found, entertaining and kind of sympathetic almost character. And at one point in the novel, Bobby gets to meet this guy too and have a big long conversation with him. And what you get the sense of in this guy is almost like somebody out of, like, if you could splice C.S. Lewis and Kafka, which is maybe the only first time anyone's ever suggested this in the history of criticism, then that's like where this thalidomide kid would come from. He's like, but he's not diabolical, but he's some kind of servant or like minor functionary in the bureaucracy of the transcendental universe. And
he ties into McCarthy's obsession. He actually wrote an essay about a few years back about the nature of the unconscious, I think. Right? Yeah. Because, you know, in some ways, Alicia has, because of her genius, I guess, or just, you know, the kind of amazingness of her mental life, I think she has more like direct conversations. Because I think the idea of the, you know, as McCarthy puts it, is that the unconscious is this, the unconscious is going 24/7 in the background, keeping you alive, and occasionally sort of slipping little ideas and thoughts your way in roundabout ways, which is often how scientific breakthroughs seem to be made, through some kind of dream or some kind of gift that's given in a kind of vision. And so the thalidomide kid becomes a kind of almost like, here's the unconscious breaking out of its background role and like getting in your face and making all kinds of weird kind of puns and word play, getting words wrong, malapropisms, kind of like that almost sense of a kind of mumbling consciousness beneath consciousness.
Yeah. Jesus, Jessica. I love all his interjections. These alliterative interjections he had with proper names, never calling her by her real name. I mean, it's an incredibly rich part of the book, actually, and almost worth the price of admission right there. This ridiculous, but also profound and terrifying, ongoing hallucinatory. Well, except that it's just clearly not. I'm going to come down and say no, they're not hallucinations. Alicia is gifted, so gifted with a sort of prophetic vision of reality that she herself can't even begin to handle it, and like prophets before her, is driven completely insane eventually. But she's yeah, she has these conversations with this guy and his entourage that point to a kind of, it's almost like some Zen joke or something. Like, it's like, what is the meaning of the universe? The thalidomide kid, it's like that's who's running the show. Except he's not. He's very intent on always insisting that he's not in charge, So, but it's one more window into the transcendent that she gets. But it's an absurd window. It's a window she can't accept, or it's a window that doesn't ever do anything for her. And like McCarthy's own ideas about the unconscious, I don't know honestly how that could square with what he shows us in the novels. He seems to think and he has I think even has Alicia say this in the second book, that the unconscious is a machine for running an animal, or a mechanism for something, a program for running an animal. And I just don't even see how, from like an evolutionary biology standpoint, that makes any sense. It's obviously functions too erratically to be any kind of real aid in day-to-day or even long-term survival. So
well, I see it as paradoxical at the very least, because it also seems to give gifts. Like it almost seems to be a means of grace in some moments, even while it maybe is also characterized as mechanistic.
Yeah.
Like, I find the wordplay so much fun because, it's not just malapropisms. There's some kind of linguistic energy that the kid has got, and it's suggestive and it's metaphorical, and it plays some pretty interesting games with language. So I don't know. I can see this. Yeah,
very Joycean actually. Yeah. Is maybe the kid's favorite reading material or something. I'm trying to remember if he comes up. So a lot of people are mentioned in the books, and someone in the chat just brought up Wittgenstein, who shows up in there. Spengler shows up in the books. There's a decent number anyway of big time intellectual figures from roughly the last 100 years who make an appearance in here. And I don't know exactly like what to make of it, except, well, so I kind of want to address a couple of things that people have said here. I'm trying I'm trying to talk and read
a very limited amount of time left.
Yeah. And get back maybe to what I said earlier, but the bringing in Wittgenstein and the line, what we can't talk about, we must pass over in silence. So, I mean, I think one thing I want to say, I want to put in a word for experimental fiction. And I think there's a kind of fiction, maybe that's the wrong word for it, that tries to push things to the limit. And I tried to write something about this a couple of years ago when I was reading Jon Fosse, the Norwegian writer's latest book, Septology, which is this huge 3-volume novel. And I thought about it a great deal when I was working on Gerald Murnane, Australian author, almost exactly the same age, if not precisely, as Cormac McCarthy, a few years ago. And there's a kind of writing that tries to get up to the limit of language, and it tries to get up to the point where you just can't say anything more. But at that point, your silence or your skepticism, your indecision is not empty of significance. It's the silence of having done as much as you could in the via positiva or cataphatic way, and you've got up to the point where you can't say anything anymore. And I felt maybe like these books it's a terrifying place to be at in real life, when you sort of feel like you've got to the end of language. And I just keep coming back to that moment at the end of The Passenger where Bobby Western is saying he prays, but he doesn't pray for anything. He just prays. Contemplative, apophatic prayer. And like, I feel like that if I had to sort of state the overall feeling of the books in a less, I don't know, maybe melodramatic way, or maybe more, I don't know, than calling it elegiac like I did at the beginning. I would call it kind of apophatic. They're books about these siblings who, yeah, they're tortured by all these things that are just beyond their control. Who their
Right.
father was, their moment in history, and the fact that they have a passion for each other that ruins the possibility of romantic and erotic connection with anyone else in a healthy way. Those all are horrifying things. They're big themes, and they impinge on these characters' fates. But ultimately, like you pointed out earlier, they're geniuses, and they're able to think up sort of to the limits of thought and push language to the limits of language. You know,
Right.
John Sheehan is a guy who can get to the limits of language and just be fun dancing around there with his hyper articulateness.
Your pleasure.
But Bobby and Alicia get there and realize it's a terrifying darkness.
Serious questions
that stares back at them. And there are some people who get to that point and they realize it's an encounter with the divine or something. And there's other people who get to that point, like Alicia, who thinks that all it reveals is this, what she calls the architron, this diabolical foundation of reality.
Right.
And,
you know, and I think alongside that elegiac element, you know, there is a sense of sorrow that haunts the books, and that goes along with elegy. And it also goes along with this kind of consistent Marian imagery that it kind of runs, in a sense, from the beginning to the end. If you think about it, the very first page of The Passenger is this, you know, farmer coming upon the body of Alicia, which is kind of frozen in a kind of perfection. You can imagine kind of the blue of the snow and the sunlight being reflected. And what does he say to himself, kind of mumble to himself? Tower of Ivory, House of Gold, which are classic litany of the Virgin Mary.
Yeah.
Also a Joyce connection. And then the second book itself is called Stella Maris, which is Star of the Sea. It's another of Mary's names. So you have all this science, but you still have religion, even if it's inconclusive, somewhat agnostic, kind of hopeful, hoping against hope. I certainly don't want to baptize Cormac McCarthy, but I don't think he fits into some easy kind of nihilistic narrative that a lot of people maybe who get scared off by the violence and the darkness are tempted to think.
I don't think you could possibly write books like this. You couldn't even want to if that's how you felt about things. What would be the point? What? The Marian stuff, I mean, that is mysterious. I haven't given it enough thought, except so you've mentioned passivity before, actually, how Bobby's like that. Especially, he seems just let things happen to him. But you know, I mean, we have I would say, an unduly negative view of passivity, or what we call passivity, in the modern West. There's another way of looking at Bobby as a kind of Marian figure, and he's willing to let things befall him and not seek after his own ambition, something that Alicia actually lacks. She has these very strong desires. She pursues her intellectual passions, and she has a very vehement desire to be with her brother and have a child with him. And she's not too reticent about saying that in her book. So she's not quite like that, but that is sort of maybe what saves Bobby, actually, is he lets himself just be pushed around. And it's a very, I like it. It's, I do a lot of martial arts stuff, especially Tai Chi, and it's actually a really important principle there. You let the other force try to do whatever it's trying to do, and then you can use that against it, or more easily get out of its way. And that's actually kind of what preserves Bobby. I mean, yeah, he gets pushed around and he ends up living in a shack on the Gulf of Mexico, and he ends up living in a barn in Idaho in the winter, and he ends up living in a freaking windmill in Spain. So he's not exactly a worldly success, but he survives this weird Kafkaesque thing that's pursuing him. This sort of hideous expression of his legacy is the son of a Manhattan Project scientist, and he does that. Maybe you could read it anyway by being passive, by giving a fiat to his strange fate.
Absolutely. And that is so Marion, be it done to me according to thy word. And again, people look at that and they can critique it and act as if it's just giving into the power structure. And yet there's so much that misses. There's such a deep awareness of the fact that we can't automatically fix things the way that his characters often want to do, especially John and Billy in the Border trilogy. That sometimes you need to let things flow over you and learn to be sculpted by them. And that's suffering and sorrow in a way, but it's also wisdom, and it's also humility in a sense, and the refusal of hubris, which is so attractive, but it ends up in that self-destruction, in that fusion reaction that slams the world together instead of opening out into grace. So yeah, well, gosh, we are running out of time, literally, and so much so that I'm not sure we can even do justice to the questions that have been posed. It feels like we should have another hour to do justice to those.
I love that Ian McGilchrist comes up there at the end, Master and His Emissary, or his Ian McGilchrist is the author, and he's got a huge 2-volume thing. The Matter with Things is his more recent publication, which I'm not done with yet, but because it's like 2,000 pages. But that's a great thing that did come to mind for me reading these books, Benjamin. I did think of McGilchrist, and but there are a lot of wonderful questions. David Foster Wallace comes up, and that would be a great. He's someone who could have gotten mentioned earlier too, because obviously tragically dead. He's it's 2008 or something, but
right.
I could see him going in a direction weirdly like these books. They're two whole generations apart, really. McCarthy and Wallace, and yet there is a weird convergence there. Maybe especially with where Wallace was going at the end of his life. Like Pale King, but the storytelling thing,
my consolation is that we have spoken to some extent to some of these questions.
We've managed to get a few of them. They're wonderful though. There's a lot to think about in these books. I mean, they're really quite profound. And one thing, maybe last thing I'll say about it is that I initially, an old friend of mine from grad school, who actually first introduced me to Cormac McCarthy's work. I texted him when I was reading these books, and I was like, "Surely you've read these. What's your take?" And he hated it. He couldn't read the second one. He thought Stella Maris was just unreadable. He said, I was completely shocked. I kind of understood, because at first Alicia really, I didn't care for her as a character. In The Passenger, we only get her through these
interludes,
outsized beginnings where she's interacting with the kid, and then in Stella Maris it's entirely conversational, and she's in conversation with this one particular person, and she's fairly hostile and kind of weird to this guy. So she's not really given a space in which to be a character as fully fledged as her brother is, who interacts with all different kinds of people, weird as they are, and is really out there in the world. And so it's hard to feel sympathetic for her. But, as the weeks have gone by since I've read these books, I find myself recalling her character more and more vividly and with more sympathy. And there's something haunting that, at least so far, is inexplicable to me about that. But McCarthy tapped into something here that I don't claim at all to fully understand yet. And particularly by creating this sibling combination, which is really quite an unusual thing, to have siblings like this, being incestuous siblings, I guess I should just come out and say, and yet he pulled it off in an astonishing way. So a real masterpiece, I think.
Yeah, and one we're going to be unpacking for a long, long time to come. All right. Well, before Zoom literally cuts us off, let me wrap up by saying that we'll be announcing the date of our next podcast soon. Slant actually has 3 books coming out in February, all with ties to a major cultural event that will take place February 17th and the 19th. It's called the New York Encounter, and it is free and open to the public. I'll be doing a session there where I'll be interviewing Ron Hansen and Christopher Beha, 2 great novelists. So if you're in the New York area, you should definitely check out the New York Encounter. The 3 books that will release on the 15th of February are Cry of the Heart on the Meaning of Suffering by Lorenzo Albacete, The Miracle of Hospitality by Luigi Giussani, and Everything I Did for Happiness, The Life of Enzo Piccinini by Marco Baldazzi. You can learn more about these titles and even pre-order them by going to their respective web pages at slantbooks.org. Tonight's episode of SlantCast has been recorded and will be soon available on both our YouTube channel and, of course, wherever you find your podcasts. Remember that you can now subscribe to SlantCast through all the major outlets, including Spotify, Apple, Audible, SoundCloud, and others. Finally, remember to tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Thanks again, and see you next time.